Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Kapner Research Council webinar series. Today is our third webinar of the spring semester, and we have one of our faculty members, Dr. Keri Jacobs, as the speaker. Dr. Pei Liu, a member of the Kapner Research Council, will make the formal introduction of our speaker. But before she does so, I would like to say a few words about the Kapner Research Council, or CRC for short. We formalized CRC about 4 years ago as an advisory council that would provide advice to my office, that is the Kapner Office of Research. We do have faculty from every division represented on the council. We also have staff, graduate students, and postdocs representation. This webinar is an example of some of the activities of the council, in addition to providing advice to my office. They also organize the annual Kapner Research Symposium, help make important decisions regarding several research-related awards for faculty and grad students in Kapner, and funding opportunities like the Joy of Discovery Seed Grant Program. When they help make important decisions in the Office of Research, they are representing you, our faculty, staff, and students. In other words, CRC plays an important role in shared governance in our college. Before I hand over to Pei, let me remind everyone that we will have a Q&A session in the end, but you need to post your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat room. Dr. Liu will be moderating the Q&A session in the end. So without further ado, Pei, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pei Liu. I'm the Associate Professor in the Department of Hospitality Management. I will be the moderator of today's webinar. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Keri Jacobs. She is Executive Director of the Graduate Institute for Cooperative Leadership and Associate Professor and MFA Chair in Agribusiness at the University of Missouri. And Keri's passion is to elevate cooperatives' success and permanence by addressing the unique needs of agricultural cooperatives nationally. Her outreach focuses on development of governance and the financial acumen of directors and employees, and on raising awareness and engagement among cooperatives members. Her research considers producers' opportunities through collectives national within their supply chains and the consequences of consolidation on agricultural cooperatives. Now we will transition to the topics of today's presentation, titled From Anecdote from Evidence, a look into governance practices of agricultural cooperatives. Thank you, Keri, for presenting today, and we can begin today's presentation whenever you are ready.
Very good. Does that look okay?
Yes, it does.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you, Shivu and Pei and Rhonda, for your help with this. It's a pleasure to be here. And I was thinking about this presentation, the introduction, there's no more explanation needed. Really what I'm presenting today is less of findings and more of our start along understanding some of the common practices among agricultural cooperatives, specifically governance practices, and how those are impacting cooperative performance. So I'm going to define some terms as we go along, and I'm looking forward to questions at the end. I'll move pretty quickly through these, but be prepared to revisit anything to the extent that this audience needs me to define or explain further. So what do I mean by agricultural cooperatives? This is a slide of a very small number of the cooperatives that I'm fortunate enough to work with through the Graduate Institute of Cooperative Leadership, also in my extension role with cooperatives. Some of these logos you will recognize as cooperatives, perhaps that you buy products at the grocery store. We consider these the consumer packaged goods cooperatives. Some of these, perhaps even a financial cooperative like FCS Financial. And then there's cooperatives on here that you may have never even heard of. When we talk about agricultural cooperatives, I have all of these in mind. And they have, regardless of whether they are a marketing cooperative that's primarily marketing a farmer's grain or dairy or fruits, nuts, or whether they are supplying inputs to producers, agronomy needs, contracting, fuel and energy, or whether they are a processing cooperative or a financial cooperative. They all have one thing, and actually two things in common, and they are owned by farmers, they are owned by the producers that use them, and they are controlled by the producers that use them. And this linkage between owning the company and controlling the company, and by control, what I'm talking about specifically is the governance function, where the members, think about this, the customers of the organization, the one who the organization is buying the milk from or marketing the grain from or selling inputs to, are also the ones serving on the board of directors. And so it creates some unique advantages, but also challenges when it comes to governance, that your customers and those who benefit from your activities are the ones that are serving on the board. So cooperatives is an area that I have a passion for, and I'm so happy to be able to talk with you all about this today. Over time, and this is not new among agricultural cooperatives, but especially today, and especially thinking about how these influence governance, I just want to tee up for you some of the challenges that we know are facing agricultural cooperatives, regardless of their size. You might have noticed the logos on the other side, CHS and Land O'Lakes are among our nation's largest agricultural cooperatives and DFA, and we have some also very small agricultural cooperatives. That would be 1/10 the size, or even 1/5, or 5% of the size of some of the larger ones. Regardless, they are all facing these changing dynamics that are representing challenges that influence and are influenced by governance practices that I'm going to talk about. So key among these are increasing heterogeneity among the membership. What I mean by that is, as farmers have consolidated, as cooperatives have consolidated and gotten bigger, their distribution of membership, members look less and less similar in terms of what they're expecting from the cooperative, how they engage with it, their own production practices, demographic dimensions, of course. And so all of these things are influencing the governance of cooperatives. And also with that, you have, thinking external to the firm, complexity of supply chains, complexity and pace of the decisions that boards of directors are expected to make with input from the manager. So all of these are factors and dimensions that we want to consider when we think about governance practices of cooperatives. And so the factors, I'm going to be talking today about a survey. I did not do the survey, but we're partnering with the center that did it. And we want to understand the governance factors that are going to play into the long-term sustainability and success, and develop tools around best practices. And so the governance factors that this survey that I'm going to talk about, that was done in collaboration with the Center for Cooperatives at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, we focus on board diversity. We focus on what makes a qualified director and recruiting qualified directors, director training and development, membership involvement in governance, and performance management. There's actually, the survey looked at a lot more dimensions in this of governance factors, but these are the ones that I'm going to focus on today. And what's in the back of my mind, and what I hope is in the back of everyone's mind, is just the complexity and the backdrop in which governance is taking place. What I mean by that is the complexity in the decision-making and in the environment of these agricultural cooperatives. So just a little bit about the survey. This survey was done by the Center for Cooperatives at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I consider this group very good friends and collaborators. I've worked with them for a long time. And I approached them and asked if it would be possible that GICL, Graduate Institute of Cooperative Leadership, participate in exploring certain portions of their survey. Their survey, they set out to be participatory. They engaged an advisory board to think about how to construct this survey. It was a survey that was going to go out and measure governance practices of all cooperatives, not just agriculture cooperatives. They used a mixed methods approach where they had online surveys, but they also had follow-up interviews where we can really develop some robust context and attitudinal questions about governance practices and performance and things that are hard to get at in survey format. And the ultimate goal of this, and this is where I think, when I think about my role with GICL, the ultimate, what we're hoping to eventually do is be able to leverage these to put out tools and best practices to help these cooperatives, to help directors, to help boards understand how they can improve their governance practices so that it can be more prepared to lead in this rapidly changing environment, rapidly complex environment. So the survey is firm level. I can say a few things about the survey. It was typically filled out, at least with agricultural cooperatives, by the CEO. In most cases, in some cases, the board chair. The goal of the survey, we've just had one round of it, is this will be longitudinal every 3 years. So the idea is we'll be able to track these cooperatives, their responses to governance practices, their attitudinal questions, and their self-measured performance over time, and understand how the tools we're developing, the best practices we're developing, our programs are influencing and helping to move them further towards what we believe are good governance practices that are going to allow them to be sustainable over time. Two primary things that attract me to this, and it is the foundation on which the survey is built, is the questions about wanting to understand the scope and prevalence of specific governance practices, and then how those are going to be translated into educational outreach programs that we can use. As someone who is building a career in extension, this is probably where I get most excited about this. And I should say, I already work with a lot of cooperative boards, and the reason the title says From Anecdote to Evidence is because there's a handful of us in the country that do this sort of work, academics, who are most often agricultural economists. And we have extension appointments where we're working directly with agricultural cooperatives or state cooperative associations that are primarily delivering programs to them. And we all recognize some of these challenges. When we get around the table, we can recognize that, hey, like, I'm seeing this, are you seeing this? But this survey is really the first opportunity we have to understand the prevalence of practices, gaps in practices, gaps in understanding on a large scale, on a national scale, across all different types of cooperatives, to really begin to formulate a more robust and all-encompassing program. So for me, that's the most exciting thing about this. Really quickly, just looking at the survey participants, I wanted to show this. I think this was sent out to more than, well, I'm going to take a guess. I think it was 4,400 surveys were sent out to cooperatives across the country. You can see here on the left-hand side how these were distributed by industry. I'm going to be talking today primarily about agriculture, including financial service companies, part of the farm credit system, for example, that serve agriculture and are primarily directed by producers. So the common thread in my theme is going to be cooperatives that have agricultural producers on their board. And I want to make it clear, when we're talking about a board of directors for cooperatives, I'm going to say that this is absolute. There are differences, but for the most part, 100% of the directors on these boards are producers. That's not entirely true. There's the use of outside directors, but for the most part, in order to be on a board of director of a cooperative, you have to be a producer, and those are the ones that vote for any changes, any investments. They control how the cooperative is going to move forward. So you can see the distribution here. You can see how Missouri was represented in this survey as well. It's important that you understand three terms, and that is the structure of cooperatives. We refer to them as primary cooperatives. What that means is it's a cooperative whose members are agricultural producers. Those can be producers who are sole proprietors. They can be family corporations. small family farms, large family farms, they are owned by a producer or a producer family. They do business primarily, the board of directors constitutes producers. Higher up than that is what we call secondary cooperatives. So think about a stacked level of cooperatives. A secondary cooperative is one whose members are not producers, but are other cooperatives. So you can think about this chain in supply chains and value chains of cooperatives whose members are producers, and then a cooperative of a cooperative, which is a secondary. Then you have hybrid cooperatives in there, and you can see that most of hybrid is where a cooperative can have direct farmer members, but also have other cooperatives that are members that are participating in the governance and that are participating in the ownership and capital structure of the organization. So some of my slides will refer to primary, secondary, and hybrid, and this is what I mean by that. Most of these responses are from primary cooperative, and where there's an important distinction, I'll try and point that out. So one of the first places we started, or that this survey started, and it's something that, of course, is it's something that I have keyed in on, I think as a woman in extension and a woman in ag. Typically the meetings that I'm going to, I am working with boards of directors that are dominated by men. And I think that's no surprise to anyone here who is familiar with agriculture, not just in Missouri, but nationally. And so this survey just kind of highlighted, and you can see that top bar there, of what the composition is on boards of producer cooperatives. We see a little bit difference in farm credit banks. They tend to have more women directors per board. I will tell you the average board size is approximately 10 to 12. Some are as low as 5, some are as many as 14, perhaps even more. Some of the mixed cooperatives or the hybrid cooperatives can have even more than that. But what's interesting to me is that, and I'll show this later, when we look at the boards of directors and wanting to understand, if we think that good decision-making, good governance comes from representation and is representative of the membership, this is concerning to me. So we know that as of the 2019 Ag Census, 29% of all principal operators in the US were women. 51% of all farming operations in the US had a woman operator. That's from the 2019 ARMS data. However, on average, primary cooperatives, those cooperatives whose members are individual producers, have on average less than 1 woman director per board. For the hybrid cooperatives, on average 1.5. 43% of agricultural cooperatives, and I'm not just talking the local, I'm talking across the nation, have an all-male board. And so for me, this is a metric in which, and a dimension in which I would like to see us make changes. I think it's especially important as we think about the next generation of who's going to be farming the land, who are going to be our producers in this country, who are our producers in this country right now, and having that additional representation on the board. To go further into this, this slide up here shows that when we survey these agricultural producers, even though a large majority have only 1 woman on the board or no women on the board, they would tell you that when they reflect on whether or not, or the CEO reflects on whether or not the demographics of the board mirror the membership overall, you can see that among agricultural cooperatives, this is close to 70% would tell you that they feel the board demographics mirror their membership demographics extremely or very well. So I think this is an opportunity for education. It is an opportunity not only for education to the board, but an education at Mizzou, at land-grant universities. We know that increasingly our ag colleges have more and more women in them as in terms of students, and there needs to be an education about the role of the cooperatives in supply chains, in farmer supply chains, and the participation and expectations of women to be involved in that. So that is something that is something I'm trying to make progress on as well. I do think, and I will say this, that this is one of the threats, in my opinion, to governance sustainability. Sustainability's organizations is the ability to optically look at and see that if I'm a woman producer, I see that an organization that I want to align with has leadership that looks like me on the board. And so I think that's so important. Another thing we looked at in the demographics, or that the survey looked at, that I'm interested in terms of my own program development, is how we recruit directors. So we know what the results are in terms of lots of demographics. I don't have time to go into all of them, but recruitment is an important piece of this. And when we look at how directors are recruited, those strategies are primarily relying on existing networks of current directors and management teams. And so there's an opportunity here for education about how we can use nominating committees to diversify our recruiting processes, perhaps reach new audiences. And there's also an education that needs to happen here about the differences between how men and women sign on to these activities, what they expect to know about their job coming into these. I think an interesting statistic that comes out of these data for me is that nearly 1/3 of ag co-ops allow an outside director. So increasingly, thinking about recruitment and diversity, more and more cooperatives are recognizing that if they can't get diversity through diversity or even participation through a traditional recruiting process and election process, they're looking to outside directors. And what that means is a director who's not a member of the cooperative, may not even be an agricultural producer. They are exploring those options, which tells me that they're recognizing a need to bring expertise into the boardroom. There are a number of questions on the survey that focused on board expertise, boardroom expertise, and how to get more of that and more perspective in the boardroom. And so this use of outside directors, and in some cases, even giving voting power to an outside director, is being used to try and move the needle in that area. It's interesting that despite the demographics I can show you and age demographics, as you can imagine, I like to joke with the boards and they take this very well, but typically when I'm the only woman in a room and I'm in a room with, 50 or so board members from all different cooperatives, the diversity is usually coming in terms of age diversity, and really not even a lot of diversity in that area. And so the ag boards that I work with, they all recognize that they need and they want to get younger producers on the board. They recognize that. But when we look at those who say they plan to prioritize board diversity, which in the survey, about half of them said they're somewhat likely to seek greater diversity on their board. We didn't define the dimension of diversity, but only half of them said they're likely to seek that, which I think is also an opportunity. Of those that are planning to do that in the next 3 years, here's the diversity metrics, here's the diversity dimensions and factors that they plan to diversify. So among ag cooperatives, which is the yellow line there, certainly gender diversity is on their list, is in their purview, but also thinking about the geographic scope of these cooperatives. Are recognizing that they need to have diversity also spatially, and diversity of age. And so you're seeing a list of also all respondents to the survey. We put some of that up there to provide comparisons, but focusing on the ag cooperatives, gender diversity and geographic diversity tend to pop out as being the ones that they have their sights on the most in the upcoming years. One of a main challenge, in my opinion, of how we think about we recruit directors, who's going to serve on the board, how we draw them to a service position. Historically, governance was viewed as primarily a voluntary role in service to this greater cause at an agricultural cooperative, at a lot of cooperatives. This norm has persisted, and while it is changing, especially among more progressive and larger cooperatives, it's not changing enough, in my opinion, especially at the local and primary level. We know that there are polls and there's competing polls on farmers' time. And for me, then I look to compensation and are we compensating directors for the time they're spending? Oftentimes, directors are spending anywhere from 4 hours to 8 hours in board meetings. It's sometimes an overnight. They have, in many cases, have to drive a distance to go to a board meeting on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. And so thinking about the director compensation piece, that's something that I think has been lagging among local cooperatives. When I look here in Missouri, I would certainly say that that's the case. And so understanding that piece of it and trying to provide tools for thinking about how to approach director compensation, I think is a missing need out there, and something that is certainly on my list. I hear a lot and my colleagues hear a lot, that we don't want directors who are only in it for the money, ergo, we don't compensate directors. Some directors come to a meeting and they might, an annual, and to attend board meetings and be a board director for a full year, survey responses would tell us they're paid $250 for a year of service. I think we need to change that. Other cooperatives have a much more robust and more progressive compensation, but this is one thing that I think we need to look at more carefully. Interestingly, I was surprised by this, when we look at other measures about whether or not the board is confident it has the right mix of people in the room or it has effective governance, we don't find much correlation between higher compensation and confidence in board duties, which I find interesting, and the amount or type of compensation. So compensation can happen through insurance programs, pensions, monthly board meetings, per diems, travel expenses. It's a pretty diverse way to think about director compensation, but it's an important piece of this. Most of the agricultural food companies that these cooperatives are competing against in their value chains and in their supply chains, directors are compensated as if it was a job for them, and they come from very oftentimes high level performing jobs in other organizations. And so I think in order to raise the level of engagement and to raise the level of acumen that we can expect on boards, we need to address this director compensation piece as well. In addition to thinking about director recruitment, once directors are on the board, thinking about development, and this is where I would say I spend a lot of my time, most of my time, as well as colleagues that I work with across the country, is understanding training and how we can train boards of directors. There's only about a handful of states in the United States that have a state cooperative council. There is a shrinking number of land grant universities that have someone hired specifically to do research and applied research and outreach to agricultural cooperatives. I feel fortunate to be at a university that has prioritized that piece of it, given the cooperative landscape in Missouri. But for most states, directors who are in cooperatives who are in a state, they may not have a state council or a land grant university cooperative extension person to look to provide these trainings. And when we think about the training that's needed, these are producers who are skilled farmers, skilled producers. They might be excellent marketing and businessmen in their own right, but to understand and to come onto a board and understand how to run a multi-million-dollar and more hundreds of million dollars organization is a big ask. And so understanding what we can do to raise the level of preparedness and development within the boards is certainly something, again, that's on the radar, my radar, as well as my colleagues. And this is how we plan to use this survey and these results to understand where really are the needs in the boardroom. You can see that most cooperatives in primary cooperatives are receiving some basic training on the cooperative model. It's shocking to me and a little saddening that it's only 82% of primary agricultural cooperatives have some sort of cooperative model training in their boardroom. Perhaps the directors come on already with that knowledge, but I think there's a lot of opportunities here and room to grow. Another piece of this effective governance that we are taking a look at is how board meetings are used. Directors come at these roles, farmers and directors come at these roles with a very hands-on approach to their own operations. They are making all the decisions in their own operations. They are very operations minded. One of the challenges is to switch that mindset in the boardroom to be thinking more about strategy and less about operations, more about where are we going in the next 3 to 5 years versus what are we doing with prices today and how are we running our operations today. So when we ask them questions about effective use and how their time is spent in board meetings, what we recognize and what we're seeing is perhaps not enough time is spent on strategy and risk management, enterprise risk management, even management evaluation. We don't have time today to go into the relationships between the board and the CEO. It's certainly something that this survey addressed, and there's really interesting dimensions of that piece of it, the interaction between the CEO and the board in terms of governance, in terms of operations. But we do know that, and again, anecdotally, we know this, and now we know this via survey, and we have some tools we can use to address this, that most board meetings don't allocate enough time to forward looking discussions, and rather are perhaps spending too much time. There's an appropriate amount of time, but perhaps too much time looking back and analyzing what has been done, or talking about what is currently going on versus what the future is looking like for their producers. An integral part of being able to drive to have an effective meeting, excuse me, is a board being able to evaluate itself. And board evaluations, when I think about the requests I'm getting in the last year, I would say the top 5 list is, we need help thinking about a board evaluation. It's a great start if boards can do an annual board evaluation. So overall as a group, how are we performing? How do we come to the meeting? What is our culture in the board meeting? Are we sticking to the agenda? These very practical things that roll up into good governance and governance practices. We need to do more of that, but we also need to understand that there are interpersonal relationships in these boardrooms. So if we look at the data here, and you look at the board as a whole, very few cooperatives on a percentage basis are actually doing board evaluations, just the whole board evaluation, not to mention evaluations of individual board members, or perhaps officer roles and committee roles. And so again, here's an opportunity for us to provide some guidance and best practices. The challenge with all of these things we might want to do and be tempted to do in terms of stating best practices, some of these are very dependent on the cooperative itself, the culture itself, and how you might go about a board evaluation process. So there certainly are challenges in developing these sorts of tools, but what's nice about this survey is it gives us insights into where really we should be focusing our efforts. And then really the last piece I want to talk about related to governance kind of brings us full circle, thinking about who's participating in the governance and thinking about member participation outside of the boardroom. So agricultural cooperatives hold board meetings, perhaps monthly, perhaps bi-monthly, but those are largely closed off to the board, which is constituted of members and the management teams, elected members and the management team. But they also have board elections and annual meetings. And over time, it's no secret that the participation by members at the annual meeting, where the elections happen, where changes in the bylaws happen, these important governing documents of the organization, where discussion happens about the future of the organization, we're seeing fewer and fewer producers show up at these annual meetings. And the concern here is about a separation or an apathy where perhaps the producers no longer view that as my cooperative versus the cooperative or the big business down the road. I think a CEO put it really well, saying it's the biggest fear of all co-ops that the company, the cooperative, becomes more important than the people who own it. And I think what he's talking about here is the perception that the co-op is separable from the members. And so part of what I try and instill in directors and members is, much like a church doesn't exist without it, the church is not the building, it's the people. The cooperative are not the buildings and the assets. The cooperative is the direction from the people. It's the assets owned by its members. It doesn't have the license to operate without the members' participation. So I think we have some work to do in terms of instilling, especially in this younger generation. There's a lot of concern about loyalty to cooperatives and beginning farmers and the younger generation. As you can imagine, that's not coming from the younger generation. It's coming from, the older generation. The older farmers have this perception that they're not able to connect. The co-op may not be able to connect with the younger generation. So I think we've got some work to do there as well. And then thinking about governance as integral to performance. And a piece of governance is certainly performance management. there were a number of questions asked that were self-rated questions about how you view, you being the person answering the survey, different performance metrics, financial performance, delivering value to members, crisis management, strategic growth, member satisfaction, risk management, and reputation. So those 7 dimensions of things that we know discussions that go on in the role of the board, in their fiduciary responsibilities, and in the responsibilities, sustainability of the organization. We wanted to understand, well, how are these things self-rated, and how might they relate to other governance practices? One of the common questions I get is, are cooperatives profit maximizers? If you're an economist, that's how you want to view the world, as businesses making profit maximizing decisions. And actually that doesn't hold true. And I think it's very interesting that when we look at the data seem to show that these cooperatives can rank themselves, for example, very high on providing member value, despite the fact that they might not have high or perceived excellent financial performance. So the correlation is positive between how someone might rate the financial performance of the cooperative versus the performance in providing member value. The correlation coefficient, just a very basic correlation coefficient, is 0.6, but it's not as high as you might expect it. And so for me, that's really a signal that the board overall, even the board's perception, is what we all kind of think about cooperatives, which are not as profit maximizers. They have to be profitable. They are for-profit organizations, but they are constrained by providing us other value in the marketplace and doing the things that bring value back to the members' own operations. I do think it's interesting that in just some very basic correlations, we aren't finding significant relationships between having the right board mix. That's what I have in quotes there, board mix. So having the right mix of people on the board in either of these dimensions of performance. And I wonder if it's because most of the cooperatives feel like they have the right people in the room, and so they're not necessarily viewing their performance through that mixed lens. And then I'll just leave us, this is my last slide. I'll leave us with some of my, so this work is not done. It's just at the beginning, and that beginning really is because of the great work that the University of Wisconsin Center for Cooperatives is doing in this cooperative governance research initiative. We are working on an ag sector report, and I think I appreciate, reaching out to me to ask me to do this webinar and talk about this research, knowing that it's leading to this other cooperative governance report. We're excited to release that. And then we begin the work of prioritizing, okay, what are the priority needs among these agricultural cooperatives? How as a group are we going to begin to address these, through what mechanisms? I think the first place that we will start is thinking about best guide practices, understanding that there's probably no great tool that's going to be a one-size-fits-all for the incredible diversity we have of agricultural cooperatives in our nation, even here in Missouri and the Midwest, but thinking about what are some best practices to help boards become better, to give management teams so they can help the boards. Key among those are recruiting practices, focusing on diversity of perspective, diversity of demographics to match the membership, board training and development, bringing up that level of acumen, especially among our local cooperatives, so that they compete better in their marketplace. They can be better fiduciaries of their organization. And then also thinking about providing assessment mechanisms within the organization, so there can be some tracking internally of how they're doing, and they can make progress in that way. So, hey, I'll end it there. I see you on the screen, and be happy to answer any questions that you or the audience has.
All right. Thank you so much for the presentation. And now let's move on to the Q&A session. I just want to remind everyone, please to use the Q&A feature to post your questions, and then I will be able to let Keri to provide your answers. So I think while we are waiting our audience to type in their questions, I do have a question for you. I think in your presentation, you talked about there's a gender imbalance for serving on the board. Obviously, there are more male members serving than female members. So have you looked into what may be the barriers or factors impacting like their willingness on contributing to serving on the boards?
I have. I'm glad you asked that question. I'm also a little nervous in how to answer this appropriately. So my experience and I'm going to share what I've seen firsthand is, first of all, very few boards that I know of approach this by having, for example, a responsibility of directors, even a listing of a basic job description. So when nominating committees or recruiting committees or even directors are going out to, to fill a ballot seat of an empty position, first of all, they're going to their networks, right? So naturally, the network of a male producer is going to include more males, right? And I think historically, women who are women operators have not thought of themselves as the primary operator, and so they haven't stepped up to those positions. But the difference I want to point out is asking them, when a man is approached to serve on an agricultural cooperative board, they have, well, let me come at it the other way. When a woman is asked, the first question, and I've heard them ask this, is, well, how do I know I'm qualified? What's expected of me? How much time is this going to take? A lot of women ask a lot of questions because they want to understand what the expectations of that role is. And we don't see those same types of questions being asked by men when they're asked to run. And I think that's just a difference in generally how genders operate. That's the way I try to explain it. I hope I'm not getting myself in too much trouble by explaining it that way, but oftentimes what I perceive is if a colleague is coming to a man, so a farmer is approaching his neighbor down the road or a producer in the area that he knows is a very good producer, there's already that camaraderie between them. There's already that rapport. And if someone's asking me to serve, they must know that I can. Whereas a woman might view that as, well, you have to explain to me how I can do this. You have to explain to me that I'm qualified. Show me that I'm qualified. So it's a very long-winded explanation, but I think it is a primary barrier, is just women want to know more about what's going to be expected. They want to know that they can be successful in that role.
Okay, I see another question here. Regarding the desire to recruit more young people to engage with their cooperatives, can you speak to the extent to which co-ops provide needed onboarding for new directors, and how many offer young producer programs to begin developing future directors?
Thanks for that question. The onboarding I would view as separate a little bit from the recruiting. So onboarding is going to happen once they've already recruited the director. And those programs, that's where we get in some of the training programs, what documents are provided, who is the new director going to speak with, how are they going to get acclimated. The young producer programs, when we're thinking about recruiting, there's two main ones. Many co-ops now, especially the larger ones, are engaging in, here in Missouri, you have the Emerging Leaders in Ag program. You have, those types of programs are happening in other states as well. Co-ops are recognizing that as part of how they're going to show their value, they want to reach out to the beginning farmers, the young farmers, perhaps the farmer that's coming on next into the land, and give them some tools, both tools that help in their own operation, but tools that get them engaged with the cooperative and share that story. So those young producer programs are really important. I think it needs to start before that. I think it needs to start, honestly, in high school. It needs to be in community colleges. It needs to be at the college level. I will say, when I high school, I went to a community college, undergrad and grad, and not once did I have a course on cooperatives. Here at Missouri, the university, we have a course on cooperatives, but very few universities have that. Do community colleges have that? Do high schools offer curriculum on cooperatives? So I think that's an important piece of it, that not only to share about, explain about the cooperative model, but to show why, how producer governance is needed and participation in governance is needed. The other program that some cooperatives are using are what called associate board programs, where they find a potential director. Often it's a young farmer or director. By the way, I recognize that young farmers, men and women, are busy with families and church activities, and maybe they're on the school board, so they really have a lot of pull on their time. These associate board programs allow a member to come in and sit through board meetings. They don't participate in the voting, but see what the job is about, get acclimated to it, understand what their role is. And so those types of programs are also quite successful for cooperatives that have that.
Thank you. Also, I do have another question. So in your presentation, you mentioned about the quality for directors, and there are certain level of different measurements for different type of qualities that the directors are lacking. So have you ever think about the gap between what the directors are lacking in terms of the qualities versus what are the capabilities they are having? So have you comparing the capabilities of the directors versus the qualities of the directors? So what are the gaps between those?
Yeah, that's something, no, I haven't. And I would be hesitant to say, and I think I made the comment, and I'm going to, like, this is where I go back to, these directors are certainly capable, competent. The question is whether or not they have access to training, they have access to development to help them understand, for example, how to read a financial statement of a cooperative balance sheet, to understand why, for example, this particular asset, which is an investment in another cooperative, how that's viewed by a lender, to help them understand how equity management programs work, very complex equity management programs and balance sheets and statement of changes in working capital. And so I think that they're certainly capable, but coming into the board, they don't necessarily, even individually or even collectively, have the perspective that might be needed. So experience, and by perspective, I mean experiences, training, they're farmers running farm operations. We do have some directors, for example, who come from, maybe they might have been a loan officer at a bank, or they were a risk manager for a company, or they were a seed salesperson. Those kinds of directors always help increase the perspective and the understanding in the boardroom of the industry generally. I think that's more about what's needed. That's more of what I meant by director quality and diversity generally. Like when we think about diversity, it's not just demographic diversity, it's diversity of experiences, skills, education, all sorts of dimensions.
Hey, Keri, I have a question for you. This is Shibu Jos. So, of course, the co-op model is very successful, highly successful in the ag sector. But I'm also seeing the expansion of the co-op model in other sectors. So can you comment about that a little bit in the US as well as internationally?
I'll start with the US. Internationally, I wish I could phone a friend on the international piece, but in the US, I wish I had a statistic in here. I'm going to get it wrong, but I'm going to take a stab. We have a number of agricultural cooperatives that have surpassed 100 years in business. And when you look at corporate longevity, so cooperatives are corporations, they are incorporated, so we would lump them in. When you look at corporate longevity, first of all, it's declining over time among non-cooperative organizations, and it's much shorter. I think a statistic I saw that the average corporation is, I don't know, maybe it's 8 years, maybe it's 9 years life. Very few have been in business 100 years, except if you look at cooperatives and agricultural cooperatives, we see very long-lived organizations. So I think that speaks to their success and something about the secret sauce about having, that alignment between ownership and control and how decisions are made to benefit those who are doing business with it. We do see, first of all, it's very hard to start a new cooperative in agriculture simply because of its capital structure and, because of its capital requirements. That's not to say it's not happening, but we certainly are seeing more cooperative formation, especially in grocery cooperatives, housing cooperatives, home healthcare cooperatives, cleaning, like employee-owned cooperatives where the employees own a cleaning business and agree to share in the profitability and govern it themselves. And so there is a boom of sorts in using the cooperative model, especially in the consumer side of cooperatives. And I think that's because I'm going to go back to something, and I have no data again to prove this, but we know that through history, cooperatives have been formed in periods where there's distrust of institutions, business institutions, government institutions, distrust of markets, instability in markets. And so I think we're in a period now, and have been for a little while, especially on the consumer side, where that lack of certainty or that lack of trust is leading to people, consumers primarily, beginning to understand that they can achieve what they collectively want to achieve without going through an investor-owned model or waiting for someone else to provide. And especially with awareness of the environment and awareness with social issues, I think that's why we're seeing a lot of cooperative formation on the consumer side. Plus, connectivity of technology makes that a lot easier, especially in the sharing economy. So there's a number of reasons which I think are underlying why we're seeing more cooperative activity and startups, especially in the consumer cooperative space and the worker cooperative space. But I think a lot of it has to do with just where we are in our history with social inequality, demographic and income inequality in this country. It's natural that we would expect to see that. So I hope that answers your question, Shibu. As far as international development, the cooperative model is something that oftentimes developing countries will rely on. What I will say is the challenge there is it's very hard to have a solid and sustainable cooperative movement that is true cooperative, owned by people, owned by producers in the case of agriculture cooperatives, if you don't have a democratic government. And so we have seen periods of time, for example, when you have a boom of cooperative activity among, for example, farmers in China, but when the Chinese government comes in and takes over those assets, seizes the land or does something like that, you have it, then you get a distrust of using the cooperative model. And that is not just unique to China, that has happened in other continents and other countries as well. I was using that as an example, but there's some certain conditions that are needed to have a strong and robust cooperative economy.
Okay, thank you, Keri.
Yeah, thank you.
So I don't see any more questions for audience. Now, I think I will pass this back to Shibu to conclude today's webinar.
Okay. Thank you, Pei. Let me also thank our speaker, Dr. Keri Jacobs, for an informative talk and leading the lively discussion. And thanks to all of you for attending today's webinar. Our next webinar will be on April 6th, same time at 3:30. Jaime Barros Rios of the Division of Plant Science and Technology will present natural variation of lignin metabolism in poplar. So again, thanks everyone. I'll see you next time.